The large classroom at the Galactic Academy was quiet except for the soft hum of the holographic display. Professor Du Jin stood tall at the front, his blue scales shimmering under the bright lights. His webbed fingers moved smoothly through the air, controlling the image of a red-orange planet that spun slowly above the students' heads. "As you can see," he said, pointing to the planet's surface, KX-291 is completely covered in sand and rock. There is no surface water. The day temperature reaches 180 degrees, and at night it drops to -90. He paused and looked at the 50 students from different alien species sitting in front of him. No intelligent species can survive here. In the back row, Han sat quietly taking notes. He was the only human in the class, and many other students often stared at his strange, water-filled body. Unlike the fish-like Professor Du Jin or the rock-skinned aliens from the mining worlds, humans were still new to the Galactic Academy. "But Professor," a crystal-based student raised her glowing arm, "what about underground? Couldn't someone live there?" Professor Du Jin shook his head. His neck fins twitched in amusement. "Our best scanners show no signs of liquid water up to 10 kilometers deep. Without water, there can be no life. This is a basic fact that all spacefaring species understand." Han's hand gripped his pencil tighter. He thought about his grandmother's stories of how his ancestors had lived in Earth's harshest deserts. They had found water where others saw only sand and death. But he stayed quiet and kept writing. "Look at these readings," Professor Du Jin continued, showing charts and numbers in the air. "The soil is too dense for normal drilling. The atmosphere is thin and full of dust. Even if you brought water, the storms would destroy any settlement within days." He smiled, showing rows of small, sharp teeth. "Nature has made a perfect death trap." The other students nodded and typed notes into their data pads. This was normal at the academy. When Professor Du Jin said something was impossible, everyone believed him. He was the galaxy's top expert on survival on extreme planets. But Han was different. While he wrote his notes with a simple pencil and paper, his mind was already working on solutions. He remembered the wooden dowsing rods his grandmother kept in her study. He thought about the old books that told how humans had found water in the driest places on Earth. As the professor kept talking about the planet's deadly features, Han quietly pulled out his personal data pad. His fingers moved quickly as he sent a message to his friend, Ji-Soo, back on Earth. She was an environmental scientist who studied desert ecosystems. "Need your help," he typed. "How did our ancestors find water in the Sahara? Professor says new desert planet impossible to live on. Think he's wrong." The reply came quickly. They used wooden sticks and watched the birds. Simple tools, but they worked. "Want me to send you the old studies?" Han smiled and looked up at the hologram of the red planet. Professor Du Jin was still talking, his voice full of confidence as he listed all the reasons why KX-291 would forever remain empty and lifeless. "And that concludes today's lecture," the professor said. "Remember, tomorrow we'll discuss actually habitable planets, ones with proper oceans like civilized worlds should have." Most students laughed at his joke. As everyone started to leave, Han stayed in his seat, still looking at his notes. The professor had given 15 reasons why survival was impossible on KX-291. Han had written all of them down. Next to each one, he had also written a small note. "Humans solved this 5,000 years ago." He waited until the room was almost empty before standing up. His hand touched the small wooden stick in his pocket, a gift from his grandmother. Tomorrow, he would show Professor Du Jin that sometimes the oldest tools were the best ones. But first, he needed to make a few calls back home. The hologram of KX-291 still floated in the air, red and deadly. Han looked at it one last time before leaving. "You're not impossible," he whispered to the empty room. "You're just waiting for the right kind of people to find your secrets." The next morning, Han walked through the shining halls of the Galactic Academy with a wooden box under his arm. Other students moved out of his way, surprised to see the human carrying something made of dead trees instead of using the data pad like everyone else. He found Professor Du Jin in his office. The room was filled with water tanks that kept the professor's skin moist in the dry air. Holograms of different planets floated around the room, including the red desert world Cakes 291. "Professor," Han said, knocking on the open door. "May I come in?" Professor Du Jin looked up from his desk, his fins moving slowly in curiosity. "Ah, the human student. Yes, enter." He waved Han in with a webbed hand. Han placed the wooden box on the professor's desk. "I want to show you something about finding water on desert planets." The professor's fins twitched. "Young man, we covered this yesterday. Cakes 291 has no water to find." Han opened the box and took out two simple wooden sticks shaped like the letter I. "These are dowsing rods. Humans have used them for over 5,000 years to find water underground." Professor Du Jin laughed, a bubbling sound that made the water in his tanks ripple. "You want to find water with sticks. This is the Galactic Academy, not a primitive history museum." "I've already called my friends on Earth," Han said calmly. He pulled out some papers, real paper, not data screens. "This is Jisoo. She's an environmental scientist. And this is Ta. He's found water in Earth's worst deserts." The professor picked up the papers carefully with his wet fingers. "Your friends use ancient methods. How quaint. They want to come here," Han said. "We propose a demonstration mission to KX 291. Let us prove that humans can find water there." Professor Du Jin's smile disappeared. "Impossible. The Academy would never approve such a waste of resources." "Actually," a new voice said from the door, "they already have." They turned to see Professor Yoon standing in the doorway. She was Earth's representative at the Academy, and her simple black suit made her look very different from the colorful aliens around her. "What?" Professor Du Jin's fins stood straight up in shock. "Who approved this?" "The Board of Scientific Discovery," Professor Yoon said, walking into the office. They found Han's proposal fascinating. A chance to study human water-finding techniques could benefit many worlds. Professor Du Jin's scales turned a darker blue. "These are primitive tools. They cannot work better than our advanced scanners." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Professor Yoon said with a smile. "In fact, the board wants you to go with them as an official observer." Han tried not to smile as the professor's fins drooped in defeat. He pulled out more papers from his box. "Jisoo and Ta will arrive next week. We've already planned the first survey area." Professor Du Jin looked at the papers, then at the hologram of KX 291. "You really think you can find water with wooden sticks where our best technology has failed?" "No," Han said. "We think we can find water with wooden sticks, knowledge passed down through generations, and modern technology working together. The old ways and the new ways can help each other." Professor Yoon nodded. "That's why the board approved this. It's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about learning from each other." Professor Du Jin was quiet for a long time, looking at the dowsing rods on his desk. Finally, his fins moved in a pattern that meant acceptance. "Very well. I will observe your attempt. But when you fail, it will prove once and for all that some planets are truly impossible to inhabit. And if we succeed," Han said quietly, "it will prove that no planet is impossible if you're willing to try new ways, and old ways, to survive." As Han packed up his box and left with Professor Yoon, Professor Du Jin picked up one of the dowsing rods. He held it wrong, his webbed fingers in the wrong places. "Primitive tools," he muttered, but he kept looking at it, wondering what secrets these simple pieces of wood might hold. The ship landed on KX 291 in a cloud of red dust. Through the thick windows, Han could see nothing but endless waves of sand stretching to the horizon. The two suns in the sky made everything glow orange. Temperature outside is 175 degrees. Jisoo said, checking her simple digital thermometer. She had arrived from Earth a week ago, bringing more wooden dowsing rods and other basic tools. We should wait until sunset before going out. Professor Dujin sat in his special water-filled seat, his scales shimmering with worry. Even at sunset, it will be too hot for my species. I will observe from the ship's camera feeds. Ta, the desert explorer, was already putting on his heat suit. It was much simpler than the complex suits the Academy had offered them. Traditional desert clothing with modern cooling, he explained. Light, simple, and if it breaks, we can fix it easily. Han watched the professor's fins twitch at the word simple. The alien scientists still didn't believe they could succeed. But Han saw something in the professor's eyes now, a tiny bit of curiosity. As the first sun began to set, Han, Jisoo, and Ta stepped onto the planet's surface. Their boots sank slightly into the red sand. The wind was hot and dry, carrying small bits of dust that sparkled in the light of the second sun. The scanners showed nothing. Professor Dujin's voice came through their radio. No water for at least 10 kilometers in any direction. Ta smiled and pulled out 2 wooden dowsing rods. The professor made a bubbling sound of disbelief over the radio. You're actually going to use those sticks. Watch and learn, Ta said. He held the rods loosely in his hands and began to walk. Han and Jisoo followed him, carrying their own tools. A mix of modern sensors and traditional water-finding equipment. They walked for an hour. The second sun was setting now, and the temperature was dropping fast. Jisoo's thermometer showed the change. 175, 150, 120, 90 degrees. Suddenly, Ta's dowsing rods moved. The wooden sticks crossed over each other, pointing down. Here, he said. There's something here. Impossible, Professor Dujin said through the radio. The scanners show nothing but solid rock below. Han took out a small drill, another simple tool. It was electric but looked like something you might find in someone's garage on Earth. He started drilling into the red sand. 2 meters down, the drill hit something hard. Jisoo took a sample and put it into her portable analyzer, one piece of advanced technology they had brought. It's crystal, she said, a type that forms only in the presence of water. That means nothing, Professor Dujin argued. Those crystals could be millions of years old, from when the planet still had surface water. True, Han said. He pulled out another tool from his bag, a simple metal rod with marks on it. This is how ancient humans measured underground spaces. Listen. He dropped the rod into the hole they had drilled. 1 second passed. 2, 3, 4. Asterisk, splash, asterisk. The sound came clearly through their radios. Even Professor Dujin went quiet. Water, Ta said simply, about 5 meters down. The crystals aren't ancient, Professor. They're growing right now, fed by an underground water source that your scanners couldn't see. But how did you know? Professor Dujin's voice was shaking. How did 2 pieces of wood find what our best technology missed? Jisoo looked up at the camera that was watching them. Because sometimes the simplest tools work best. They don't get confused by other signals. They don't try to do too many things at once. They just find water. Han started setting up their drilling equipment, bigger than the first drill, but still simple enough that they could repair it themselves. Above them, the last sun set, and the temperature began to drop even faster. But they didn't mind the cold. They had found what they came for. In the ship, Professor Dujin stared at his scanner screens, which still showed no sign of water. Then he looked at the camera feed, where 3 humans were preparing to reach the impossible water his technology said didn't exist. For the first time in his long career, he wondered if perhaps he had something to learn from these primitive tools after all. The next morning, Professor Dujin insisted on leaving his water chamber to see the water himself. He wore a special suit that kept his scales wet as he walked carefully to the drilling site. Impossible, he said for the 10th time, staring at the clear water they had pumped up from underground. Our scanners should have found this. Jisoo was testing the water with both modern equipment and simple chemical strips. The water is pure, she said, and there's something interesting about it. She held up a strip that had turned bright blue. It's not just one underground pool. There are traces of minerals that suggest a whole network of water paths under the surface. Han walked around the area with a device he had made himself. It looked like a metal box with two antennas wrapped in copper wire. The professor watched him with curiosity. What is that primitive device supposed to do? Professor Du Jin asked. It measures tiny changes in electromagnetic fields, Han explained, like the ones that moving water creates underground. My grandmother taught me how to make it. The dowsing rods find water because humans can feel these tiny changes through the wood. This device just makes those changes easier to see. Tai was marking spots on a paper map where his dowsing rods had reacted. He connected the dots with a pencil, drawing lines across the red desert. Look at this pattern, he said. It's like a river network, but all underground. Professor Du Jin moved closer to look at the map. His fins twitched with growing interest. But our scanners. Your scanners look for large bodies of water, Jisoo said kindly. These are small channels, worn through the rock over millions of years, like tiny caves full of water. She pointed to her computer screen. The minerals in the water suggest it's all connected. One huge underground system. Han's device started beeping loudly. He walked slowly in a circle, and the beeping got louder in one direction. There's more water that way, he said. A lot more. They followed Han across the desert. The second sun was rising now, making the temperature climb quickly. Professor Du Jin's suit sprayed water mist every few minutes to keep his scales wet. After 20 minutes of walking, they found something that made even the professor gasp. In front of them was a large circle of crystals poking out of the sand. They sparkled with all colors of the rainbow under the two suns. These crystals, Professor Du Jin touched one gently with his webbed hand. They're growing right out of the ground. That means there's a large water source right below us. Jisoo finished. She was already setting up her testing equipment. The crystals grow where the water comes closest to the surface. Ta walked around the crystal circle with his dowsing rods. The wooden sticks crossed and uncrossed in a regular pattern. It's moving, he said. The water down there is flowing like an underground river. Han turned on his electromagnetic device. The readings were stronger than before. This isn't just a river, he said. I think we found one of the main channels, like an underground highway for water. Professor Du Jin was very quiet. He looked at the crystals, then at Han's simple device, then at Ta's wooden dowsing rods. Finally, he spoke. On my world, he said slowly, we believe that truth can only come from the most advanced technology. He touched one of the crystals again. But here you are, finding what our best machines could not see, using tools made of wood and simple electronics. Jisoo smiled at him. The best tool is the one that works, Professor. Sometimes that's a 1,000,000-credit scanner. Sometimes it's a stick that helps you feel what's under your feet. The professor nodded. His fins moved in a way that showed deep thought. Perhaps, he said, it is time for the Galactic Academy to learn some of your simple ways. Above them, the two suns shone on the red desert. But now they all knew the truth. This was not a dead world. Under their feet, hidden from the most advanced scanners, but found by the simplest tools, a network of rivers was waiting to be mapped. The desert had kept its secret for millions of years, until humans came with their wooden sticks and copper wire to listen to its whispers. The next 3 days were busy on Cake 291. Han and his team worked during the cooler hours when only one sun was in the sky. They had found more water sources, but now they needed to prove they could get to it easily. Watch this, Jisoo said to Professor Du Jin. She had set up a strange-looking device made of clear plastic sheets arranged in a dome shape. This is a solar still. It's one of the oldest ways humans collected water in deserts. The professor moved closer in his water suit, his fins showing interest. What does it do? It pulls water from the air, Jisoo explained. She pointed to drops of water forming on the inside of the plastic dome. The sun heats the air inside. When the water vapor hits the cool plastic, it turns back into liquid. Professor Du Jin blinked his large eyes. But there is almost no water in this air. Our sensors show less than 1% humidity. That's enough, Han said. He was setting up more solar stills nearby. Humans learned to get water from air this dry thousands of years ago. We just made the old method better with new materials. Ta came back from his morning walk, his dowsing rods tucked under his arm. He had drawn more lines on his map. The underground rivers are all connected, he said, like a giant web under the sand. But the interesting part is this. He pointed to several spots on the map marked with red X's. What are those marks? The professor asked. Places where the water comes closest to the surface, Tai explained. Jisoo's tests show the water there is only 30 meters down, much easier to reach than the deep spots your scanners were looking for. Professor Du Jin watched his hand set up a drilling rig. It was smaller than the huge machines the Academy usually used. That drill seems too small, he said. Small is good, Han said. It uses less power. If it breaks, we can fix it ourselves. He started the drill. It made a quiet humming sound as it went into the ground. We're not trying to make huge wells. We just need enough water for a small station. Jisoo checked her collection tanks. The solar stills had gathered 20 liters of water overnight. See, she said to the professor. Simple methods, but they work. Between the stills and the shallow wells, a small team could survive here easily. Professor Du Jin picked up one of the dowsing rods from Ta's pack. He held it carefully in his webbed hands. Could you show me how to use this? Ta smiled. Hold it loosely, he said. Don't grip too tight. Let it move on its own when it feels the water. The professor tried walking with the rod. At first, nothing happened. Then, near one of their marked spots, the rod twitched in his hands. His fins stood straight up in surprise. I felt something, he said, like a tiny pull downward. That's the water calling, Ta said. The wood helps you feel the small changes in energy that water makes underground. Your body knows what it means, even if your machines can't see it. Han's drill hit water then, sending up a spray of liquid that sparkled in the sunlight. Jisoo tested it quickly. Pure and clean, she said. Another good source. Professor Du Jin looked at the water, then at the dowsing rod in his hands, then at the simple solar stills collecting water from the dry air. His fins moved in a pattern that meant deep understanding. I have taught at the Academy for 50 years, he said quietly. I thought I knew everything about finding water on other worlds. But here you are, using tools made of wood and plastic, finding water that our best technology missed. Han patted the professor's shoulder. The old ways and the new ways both have value, he said. That's what humans learned on Earth. Sometimes you need a 1,000,000 credit scanner. Sometimes you need a stick of wood. The trick is knowing when to use each one. The professor nodded. The dowsing rod was still in his hands, and he held it like something precious. Above them, the second sun was rising, bringing another day of heat. But now they all knew the desert's secret. There was water everywhere, if you just knew how to look for it. Jisoo saw it first, a dark line on the horizon that shouldn't be there. She was checking the solar stills when she noticed the strange darkness in the sky. Ta, she called out. Look at that. Ta stopped his morning water testing and looked up. His face turned serious. Sandstorm, he said. A big one. Han. Professor, we need to prepare. Professor Du Jin came out of the ship, his fins moving in worry. The ship's computer says the storm is moving very fast. We should leave now. No time, Han said, checking his simple weather meter. The storm will hit us before we can get the ship ready for takeoff. We need to shelter here. The professor's scales turned pale. But the ship's shields might fail in such a storm. The sand will damage everything. Then we do it the old way, Ta said calmly. He was already pulling supplies from their storage. Han, help me with the storm shelter. Jisoo, get the water secured. The dark line in the sky was growing bigger. The wind was getting stronger, making the sand dance around their feet. Professor Du-jin watched in fear as his sensors started showing error messages. Our technology can't handle this level of electromagnetic disturbance, he said. The storm is affecting all our equipment. That's okay, Han said. He and Tai were building something that looked like a low tent made of special fabric. We brought supplies to survive without machines. Jisoo was covering the solar stills and moving the water containers to a safe place. She had done this many times on Earth. The wind was howling now, throwing small rocks through the air. Professor, she called out, get in the shelter. Your water suit might not handle the sand. The professor hurried into the fabric shelter. Inside, it was stronger than it looked. Ta had built it using designs that desert people had used for thousands of years. The shape would let the sand flow over them instead of burying them. But how will we breathe? Professor Du-jin asked. The sand will get in. Han showed him a simple mask made of wet cloth. Like this. The wet cloth catches the sand but lets air through. Ancient desert travelers used these. The storm hit them like a wall. Outside, their advanced equipment started shutting down. The ship's external sensors failed. The computer screens went dark. Even the professor's water suit started showing warning lights. But inside the shelter, they were safe. The special fabric kept out the sand while letting them breathe. Jisoo's water containers stayed secure in their simple storage space. Ta had placed the shelter perfectly so the storm wouldn't bury them. Listen to that, Han said as the storm raged. Sounds like a freight train. Professor Du-jin's fins were shaking. All our technology is failing. We are stuck on the most dangerous planet I've ever studied, in the worst storm I've seen, protected by fabric and wet cloths. Sometimes the simple solutions are the best ones, Ta said. He was checking the shelter's supports calmly. Desert storms haven't changed in millions of years. The old ways of surviving them still work. Hours passed. The storm screamed around them. Sand hit their shelter like millions of tiny bullets. But the fabric held. The wet masks let them breathe. The water stayed safe in its simple containers. Finally, the noise began to die down. The wind became quieter. Jisoo carefully looked outside through a small window in the shelter. Storm's passing, she said. We made it. When they finally went outside, they saw their advanced equipment covered in sand. The ship's external panels were scratched. The sensors were clogged. But their simple tools, the dowsing rods, the solar stills, the water containers, were all fine. Professor Du-jin looked at the fabric shelter, then at his damaged water suit, then at the humans who had survived the impossible storm with nothing but old knowledge and simple tools. Perhaps, he said slowly, the Academy's next class should be about the value of traditional survival methods. The day after the great storm, the team began their most important work. They needed to prove to the Galactic Academy that KX-291 could support life. The storm had given them an unexpected way to do this. Look here, Jisoo said, pointing to spots where the storm had blown away the top layer of sand. The storm revealed more crystal formations. They're everywhere. Han was walking with his electromagnetic detector, which was working again after they cleaned out the sand. The device was beeping more than ever before. The storm changed the surface, he said. Now we can see more of the underground water network. Professor Du-jin had fixed his water suit and was examining the new crystals. His fins moved with excitement. These patterns, he said, touching the crystal gently. They show that water is moving under the surface, like a huge river system. Ta was updating his map, adding all the new water signs they had found. The storm helped us, he said. Now we can see that the whole area is connected by underground water. It's like a hidden ocean, split into thousands of small rivers and pools. They worked through the cooler morning hours, gathering proof. Jisoo's tests showed that the water was clean and had minerals good for life. Han's simple devices mapped the electromagnetic patterns that showed where water flowed. Ta's dowsing rods found more water spots than they could count. But will the Academy believe all this? Professor Du Jin asked. He was holding one of the crystals, studying how it caught the light of the two suns. They trust machines more than traditional methods. That's why we brought both, Han said. He connected his devices to the ship's working computer. Look at this. The electromagnetic readings match perfectly with where Ta's dowsing rods found water. And Jisoo's tests prove the water is real. Old ways and new ways working together. Jisoo had set up a new kind of test. She had taken small plants from Earth, special desert plants that could live with very little water. She planted them in soil from HFY 291, watering them with the planet's underground water. See, she said, showing them the plants after a few hours. They're already growing. The water here isn't just clean, it's perfect for life. Professor Du Jin watched the small green plants with wonder. In all my years of studying planets, he said, I never thought to try something so simple. We always run complex tests, but never just plant a seed and see if it grows. Ta smiled. Sometimes the best test is the simplest one, he said. If a plant can grow here, other life can too. They spent the rest of the day preparing their report for the Academy. But instead of just sending data, they did something different. Han set up a camera, and they filmed themselves showing how they found water. They showed how the dowsing rods worked, with Professor Du Jin himself demonstrating how to use them. They showed the solar stills collecting water from the dry air. They showed the growing plants, the crystal formations, and the electromagnetic readings. And most importantly, Han said to the camera, we survived the worst storm anyone has seen on this planet. Not with advanced shields or high-tech barriers, but with simple tools and ancient knowledge. Professor Du Jin spoke last in the video. His fins were straight and proud. I used to think this planet was impossible to live on, he said. I was wrong. These humans found water that our best scanners missed. They survived a storm that disabled our best technology. They proved that sometimes the old ways are the best ways. As they sent the report to the Academy, Jisoo checked her growing plants one last time. They were already getting bigger, their green leaves bright against the red sand of HFY 291. Life finds a way, she said softly. All it needs is a chance and a little bit of water. The two suns were setting, painting the desert in gold and red. But now they all knew. This wasn't just a desert anymore. It was the beginning of something new, a place where old wisdom and new science had come together to unlock the secrets of an impossible world. 1 month later, the Great Hall of the Galactic Academy was full. Students and teachers from 100 worlds had come to hear about HFY 291. Professor Du Jin stood at the front, but he wasn't alone. Han, Jisoo, and Ta stood with him, their simple tools displayed on a table beside the Academy's advanced machines. My fellow teachers, Professor Du Jin began, his fins moving with pride. I was wrong about HFY 291. I said no one could live there. I said our machines proved it was impossible. But I learned something important from these humans. He picked up one of Ta's dowsing rods. Many aliens in the crowd looked confused at the simple piece of wood. This stick, the professor said, found water that our best scanners missed. Why? Because sometimes the simplest tool is the best tool. Jisoo stepped forward. She showed pictures of her plants, now grown tall and strong in HFY 291 soil. The planet isn't dead, she said. It has everything needed for life. We just had to look for it in the right way. Han demonstrated his electromagnetic detector, showing how it worked with both the dowsing rods and the Academy's machines. Old knowledge and new technology can work together, he explained. Each one helps the other work better. Tai spread out his map on the table. It showed the whole network of underground water they have found. The desert kept its secret for millions of years, he said. But humans remembered how our ancestors found water in Earth's deserts. That old knowledge helped us see what was hidden. The crowd was quiet for a moment. Then an older alien stood up. She had skin like crystal and spoke in a voice like ringing bells. Are you saying we should stop using advanced technology? No, Professor Dujin answered quickly. We're saying we should use everything that works. Sometimes that means giant computers. Sometimes it means wooden sticks. The secret is knowing when to use each one. He showed a video of the Great Storm, how their simple shelter survived when advanced equipment failed. This taught me something important, he said. New isn't always better. Old isn't always worse. They're just different tools for different jobs. Han stepped forward again. The Academy teaches us to use the newest technology, he said. That's good. But maybe it should also teach us about older ways. Maybe every planet has secrets that can only be found with simple tools. Professor Dujin nodded. His fins moved in a pattern that meant complete agreement. That's why I'm starting a new class, he announced. It will teach both old and new ways of survival. These humans will help me teach it. The crystal-skinned alien spoke again. But they're so primitive. Jisoo smiled. She held up a glass of clear water from HFY 291. This water was found with primitive tools, she said. It's clean enough to drink. Sometimes primitive works perfectly. Tai added, our ancestors survived on Earth for thousands of years before computers existed. They passed down their knowledge through generations. That knowledge still works today. The crowd began to nod. Some aliens were already asking to hold the dowsing rods, curious about how they worked. Others wanted to see Han's simple electromagnetic detector. Professor Dujin raised his hands for quiet. 1 month ago, I said HFY 291 was impossible to live on. Now we're planning the first research station there. And do you know what tools we'll use to build it? He pointed to the table where old and new tools lay side by side. All of them, he said. Every tool that works, whether it's 1,000,000 years old or brand new. Because that's how we move forward, not by forgetting the past, but by bringing it with us into the future. The crowd clapped and cheered. As Han looked around the great hall, he saw aliens of all kinds picking up the dowsing rods, learning to hold them correctly. He saw Academy teachers taking notes on the solar still design. He saw the future changing, one simple tool at a time. Above them, through the Academy's giant windows, the stars shone brightly. Somewhere out there, HFY 291 was waiting, its hidden waters ready to be found by anyone wise enough to use both the old ways and the new.